People taught you that forgiveness is a virtue, that only noble souls can let go and love unconditionally. You believed that, lived by it, and forgave over and over again, even when each forgiveness shattered a part of you. You forgave the lies disguised as tenderness, the cold actions justified by, "I'm only trying to protect you." You forgave because you feared losing love, because you feared becoming bitter, because you believed kindness was powerful enough to transform darkness. But somewhere deep inside, you began to realize some people do not need your forgiveness to be saved. They need you in order to continue existing within their control. And as long as you keep forgiving, they keep holding power. Forgiveness in the hands of someone without a conscience becomes a tool of manipulation. They know you will always soften, always return, always shoulder part of the responsibility for the harm they caused. You think you're freeing them, but in reality you are imprisoning yourself in an endless emotional spiral. Carl Jung once said, "There is no awakening without pain." And that pain is the moment you start to see clearly how many times you have betrayed yourself just to be seen as a good person. When you realize that compassion is no longer light, it has become chains. When you stop saying, "I forgive you," just to keep the peace, and begin saying, "I choose myself," that is not selfishness, it is awakening. Because the truth is, not all forgiveness is noble. Some forgiveness is born from love, but some forgiveness is born from fear. Fear of losing someone, fear of being disliked, fear of facing the emptiness that appears when a boundary is finally set. And it is that fear that keeps you enduring, keeps you finding excuses for your pain, keeps you blindly calling endurance love. But then one day you grow too exhausted to keep pretending. You realize that unconditional forgiveness does not make you an angel, it makes you lose connection with your own soul. You understand that real love is not rescuing someone from their consequences, but allowing them to learn their own lessons while you protect your own light. Forgiveness is no longer something you do for them. It becomes something you do for yourself when you stop allowing others to keep hurting you under the label of love. When you say, "I choose myself," that is the first moment of sovereignty. It is when kindness is no longer an obligation but a conscious choice. It is when you learn to love without rescuing, to help without losing yourself, to walk away without hatred. You are not abandoning compassion, you are maturing it. And in that choice, you step for the first time out of the karmic emotional loop, where the manipulator loses control and you reclaim ownership of your own energy. Because choosing yourself is not abandoning someone else, it is returning to the part of you that you have neglected for far too long. It is the bravest act and the deepest expression of love, love for your own soul. Part I. When kindness becomes a trap. Empaths often don't realize that their very kindness can become a trap. They grow up hearing things like, "Forgive, everyone makes mistakes," or "If you truly love someone, you must know how to yield." So they carry those beliefs into their relationships, believing that if they are loving enough, patient enough, compassionate enough, the other person will eventually change. But reality is different. With a narcissistic or controlling person, every time you forgive them, it doesn't make them grateful, it convinces them they still have power. Imagine yourself in a relationship full of conflict. You are insulted, spoken to in ways that hurt, but then they come back apologizing, promising to change. They cry, they say they're stressed, they tell you that you are the only one who understands them. You soften, you forgive, you give another chance. But within days or weeks, the same cycle repeats. You become the one trying to keep the peace while they push boundaries further and further. Forgiveness here is no longer an act of love. It becomes a survival mechanism. You forgive to avoid arguments, to avoid abandonment, to hold on to the last remnants of a connection you once believed was special. The truth is, you don't forgive because you're not hurt. You forgive because you're afraid. Afraid that if you don't, you'll lose them. Afraid that if you speak your truth, you'll be seen as difficult, selfish, not understanding enough. And that fear locks you into the toxic cycle of hurt apology, Forgiveness hurt again. You call it love, but in reality, it's emotional addiction. You're addicted to the hope that appears when they act remorseful, and addicted to the brief relief that follows reconciliation. Carl Jung once said, "What we resist persists." Empaths often resist their own anger, fearing that if they become angry, they will resemble the one who hurt them. But their inability to express anger keeps them trapped in the role of the good person. They think staying silent is maturity, compromise is wisdom, but in truth, they are sacrificing reality to maintain the illusion of peace. Think of the times you said it's okay when you were clearly not okay. The times you said, "I understand," just to avoid a fight. The times you returned to someone who made you lose sleep simply because you believed that everyone deserves a second chance. None of those moments were love. They were moments you chose someone else over yourself. And then your body reacts before your mind understands. You feel tired for no reason, sleep becomes restless, and you start living in a constant state of alertness. Sometimes, even a text from them makes your heart race not from excitement, but fear of what might happen next. That is the sign that you are living in survival mode, not love. Empaths often think they are tolerant, but in truth, they are numbing themselves. Each time you forgive without real change, you teach the other person that you will always be there, that they don't need to grow. That kind of forgiveness is no longer healing, it is silent, self-abandonment. Eventually you start to hear a small voice whispering, "Enough." At first you ignore it, believing it's temporary exhaustion. But the voice returns, louder, each time. It doesn't come from anger, it comes from the awakened part of you, the part of your soul that knows that if you don't stop, you will lose yourself. That is the moment when kindness becomes awareness, when you finally see that forgiveness is no longer noble, it has become a form of self-harm. And from that moment, one chillingly honest question rises. If this love requires me to repeatedly forgive the unforgivable, is it still love? That question, not anger, is the true beginning of an empath's awakening. Part 2. The moment of awakening, when the empath decides to stop. The truth is, the moment an empath stops does not arrive with shouting or tears, it arrives in a strange silence. No more arguing, no more explaining, no more trying to make the other person understand. One morning, they simply wake up feeling empty, not because of pain, but because they have finally grown too tired to continue. They look back at the long string of apologies and promises, the nights of waiting and self-soothing, and they see clearly that what they called love has long turned into attachment, addiction, and fear of abandonment. In this stage, the empath finally recognizes a truth they once avoided. They are no longer in love with who the person truly is. They are in love with their potential, the illusion they created to justify their suffering. They recall the moments when the other person acted vulnerable, the words, "I don't know how to live without you," which once felt genuine. Now, they see it for what it was, emotional manipulation, a tactic used by narcissists to maintain control when they sense it slipping. For the first time, the empath stops reacting. They don't try to prove themselves, don't need to be understood, don't need to defend. That "I wasn't wrong." They simply withdraw not because they don't care, but because they understand that real relationships do not require anyone to beg for respect. Silence is no longer endurance, it becomes sovereignty. They stop seeking justice from the unjust, stop seeking validation from someone who never truly listened. When the empath chooses silence, the narcissist panics, because all their power comes from your reactions, your tears, your pain, your attempts to explain. Your silence signals the loss of their emotional supply, so they shift strategies. Sometimes remorseful, sometimes angry, sometimes playing the victim, sometimes using "I'm depressed" as a lure to pull you back in. But once you have truly chosen yourself, you see the game clearly. You are no longer moved by promises, tears, or memories. You no longer feel sorry for their suffering, because you understand their pain is not true remorse. It is desperation from losing control. During this period, the empath goes through deep internal conflict. Part of them still wants to believe the narcissist can change, while the wiser part knows they never will. This is the stage of inner war between the heart that wants to hold on and the soul that wants freedom. There will be tears, moments of weakness, moments of questioning whether they're being too harsh. But then something strange happens. The pain begins to lose its intensity. Old texts and memories that once made the heart tremble now feel faded. Not because the empath has become cold, but because their consciousness has moved beyond dependency. Carl Jung called this the death of the persona, the death of the mask that made us believe our worth comes from being loved by others. When that mask falls, the empath no longer needs to be understood, forgiven, or proven good. They begin valuing truth more than image. And the truth is, love cannot exist where respect has died. With each passing day, they feel something new: peace. Not peace because things are smooth, but peace because they no longer need to control the outcome. They begin doing small things they once neglected, taking walks without checking their phone, eating breakfast without waiting for a message, listening to music without choosing songs tied to memories. These small things are signs that they are returning to themselves. The awakening of an empath does not come like thunder. It comes like a slow sunrise. Light seeps into the corners where only darkness, expectations, and illusions once lived. And in that light, they see clearly. Forgiving someone who does not value you is no longer noble. It is meaningless. Forgiving without change is nothing more than rewriting the same tragedy with the same script. This is the turning point where compassion transforms into wisdom, where the empath stops saving others and begins saving themselves. Part 3. When choosing themselves means losing everything and beginning to have everything. After stopping, the empath enters a terrifyingly empty phase. No more long texts explaining everything, no more crying then making up, no more half-hearted apologies. Their silence becomes an echoing space, and in that space they finally face what they used to avoid the most themselves. No one tells empaths that after leaving a toxic relationship, they don't just lose the other person, they also lose the old version of themselves, the one who lived for others, who was defined by healing, who felt valuable only when needed. They don't know what to do when there is no one left to save. And in those first days, the loneliness doesn't come from being abandoned, but from no longer having a familiar role to cling to. Everything feels strange. Mornings no longer bring controlling messages, but instead a silence that tightens their chest. They begin to miss not the person, but the feeling of being connected, even if that connection was through pain. Because for so long, the tension, arguments, and reconciliations had become the rhythm of their life. When that rhythm disappears, they fall into an emotional void. No more adrenaline, no more highs, only a stillness the mind doesn't yet know how to tolerate. Many empaths in this phase go through emotional withdrawal. They don't understand why they still want to text, still want to just say one last thing. But in truth, it's not because they want to go back, it's because they are addicted to the familiar feeling. Like a body that has lived in chaos suddenly being placed in calm, it doesn't know how to exist there. This is when the mind starts offering all kinds of reasons. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe this time they really mean it. I'm not perfect either. But the soul knows this is only the resistance of the past, the ego's way of clinging to its old comfort zone. Jung called this the resistance of transformation, because any awakening must pass through loss. And this loss is not just of a person, but of the false self that lived to be loved. And then something quiet begins to happen. In the loneliness, the empath slowly realizes they are still alive. No one is praising their gentleness. No one is making them anxious. But suddenly they start hearing their own voice, the voice that had been drowned out by excuses and guilt. That voice is not loud, but it is clear, like an old friend returning after years of being forgotten. They begin to observe themselves, the habit of shrinking, the way they apologize, even when not wrong, the anxiety whenever someone else is upset, the fear of saying no. And little by little, they realize this is not kindness. It is programming born from fear. They were not born to be anyone's shield. They had simply forgotten that they too deserved protection. Then, one day, they look back at the person who once made them cry countless times and realize their feelings have changed color. No more hatred, no more longing, just a quiet understanding. I used to be there, but I am not there anymore. That is the sign of true release. Not when you forgive logically, but when your heart no longer needs an answer. From here, something profound begins to take shape. They understand that choosing themselves is not turning their back on love, but choosing real love. Love with boundaries, respect, and awareness. They learn to say no without feeling guilty, to stay silent without feeling the need to explain. They realize that kindness has no value if it demands the sacrifice of their own self. And then they begin to regain everything not from the outside, but from within. Sleeping better, laughing more genuinely, feeling emotionally stable. The people who once terrified them no longer have power over their mood. They no longer check their phone constantly, no longer feel I must do something to keep this relationship. Instead, they feel enough. Enough peace, enough clarity, enough worth. That is the moment their soul truly returns. No longer the fragile empath who always forgives in order to be loved, but the awakened empath who knows that real love does not come through enduring, but through being honest with oneself. And in that honesty, they no longer need anyone to apologize because they no longer need to keep suffering. Part 4. When the empath is reborn from ruins. When the empath has gone through the loneliness of leaving and survived emotional withdrawal, they enter a completely new phase rebirth. No more illusions that love will save everything. No more naive belief that kindness is always rewarded. At this point, they no longer seek answers from others, but from their own experience. And they begin to realize something profound. No one can keep hurting them forever if they stop giving that person power. After the storm, the first thing they notice is the quiet in their mind. No more overthinking, no more analyzing every message or reading into every facial expression. Their mind no longer lives in a state of hypervigilance, something they once mistook for sharp intuition. They now understand that it wasn't a gift, but chronic anxiety formed from having to read other people's emotions in order to survive. Now, they begin to learn how to feel the world through themselves, not through someone else's mood, but through what they truly want, truly feel, truly need. In this rebirth phase, empaths no longer seek peace from outside. They create it from within. They start to rebuild their life bit by bit, with small things they once considered meaningless. Rearranging their room, learning to eat a proper meal, going for a walk without headphones to soothe the mind, journaling instead of texting someone an apology. Every small act becomes a sign that they are coming home to their own body and soul. But this process is not just recovery, it is a restructuring of their being. To choose themselves, they must face the parts that were buried. Suppressed anger, fear of abandonment, and even the shame of having accepted less than they deserved. They begin to see that true light is never separate from darkness. To heal, they cannot merely say, I forgive, and let go. They must dare to face the truth. I once colluded with my own pain. This is the moment Jung called Nigredo the blackest stage of transformation. All illusions dissolve, leaving only the raw material of the soul, awaiting rebirth. The empath feels as if they are redrawing a new map of life, where there are no longer blurred boundaries between love and endurance, between selflessness and self-destruction. They begin to understand deeply that true compassion never requires self-erasure. From here, their kindness changes form. It becomes quieter, deeper, and more intelligent. They no longer rush in to rescue someone. They learn how to witness another's pain without absorbing it, how to listen without carrying it, how to love without dissolving. That is the difference between blind compassion and compassion that has matured. And then they start to notice something remarkable. When they stop trying to fix others, their own real self begins to appear. They no longer need to strain to prove they are kind or lovable. The peace within naturally makes them magnetic. They don't need to say, I am strong. Their silence says it for them. Interestingly, as they become grounded, those who once manipulated them begin to feel uncomfortable. The empath is no longer easily dragged into emotional whirlwinds, no longer reacts to provocation. They simply see the truth and walk away. And in that calm gaze, the narcissist for the first time feels small because their power existed only as long as you needed them. The empath now no longer forgives to preserve the relationship. They forgive to end it in peace. Forgiveness is no longer reaching down to save, but untying the knot. They understand that true forgiveness doesn't come from pity, but from the realization that no one can hurt you if you no longer stay in the role of victim. When they walk away without a speech, without proof their inner world changes, for the first time in their life, they feel solid, not the solidity of being loved, but the solidity of knowing who they are. They begin to see the world with different eyes, no longer as villains and saints, but as souls learning through pain. They no longer seek revenge or hope for karma, because they understand that their silence is already the greatest karmic consequence for the other person. That is the moment the empath completely crosses the old threshold. They don't just survive, they are reborn, no longer the one who was hurt, but the one who has learned to turn pain into awareness, wounds into freedom. And in the stillness after the storm, they know that this time they will never abandon themselves again. Part V. When compassion becomes wisdom. After all the ruins, the empath steps into another stage where kindness is no longer an instinct, but a conscious choice. This is no longer the kind of compassion that makes them hurt themselves to protect others, but a compassion forged through fire, experience, tears, and clarity. They now understand that love does not mean tolerance of everything, and forgiveness does not mean going back. In this stage, the empath begins to operate from a completely different energy, the energy of clear discernment. They no longer see people only through emotion, but through quiet observation. When someone tells a sad story, they still feel empathy, but they no longer automatically jump in to save them. They have learned the biggest lesson. Not everyone who suffers actually wants to heal, and not everyone who looks weak is a victim. Some people suffer because they are attached to the power their suffering gives them. The empath can now see this without judging and without getting involved. This is what real spiritual maturity looks like when they understand that compassion no longer means, I must do something. They can sit still in the middle of chaos, listen to someone rage, and still keep a calm inner field, because they know rescuing someone before they are ready is stealing the lesson life is trying to deliver to them. They no longer fear being called cold or unfeeling, because they understand that boundaries are not walls, but doors that keep love clean. At a deeper level, they realize that forgiveness is no longer an action to perform, but a natural state when they are no longer attached. True forgiveness is not saying, I let you off the hook, but reaching the point where the memory carries no negative charge. When they look back, the heart no longer spikes with pain, but feels gratitude, not gratitude for the one who hurt them, but gratitude for themselves for surviving and growing. Now, the empath no longer lives in reaction mode. They don't need to prove they are kind, don't need anyone to validate that they are good. They understand that kindness is not a role, but an essence, and that essence does not need to be witnessed to have value. They also no longer search for a healer or a fated relationship, because they realize that everything they once searched for outside had always been inside them. Carl Jung called this stage individuation, the process of the soul becoming whole. The empath is no longer pulled between the poles of saving others and enduring everything, but finds the balance point between love and self-respect. They understand that true compassion never separates from truth, because if a relationship forces you to distort truth to maintain it, it is no longer love, it is addiction. In reality, when the empath begins to live with this discernment, some people around them will feel uncomfortable, because they are no longer predictable, no longer easy to please, no longer easy to exploit. They can say no gently, leave without apologizing, keep distance while still being respectful. For those who rely on control, This calmness becomes a threat. But the empath no longer cares. They don't need to defeat anyone. They only need to stay honest with their own energy. And then the most miraculous thing happens. Real connections begin to appear. When they live in alignment with their own energy, they attract those who are on a similar path. People who love with awareness, are not afraid of the dark, and don't need to fake strength. Conversations become deeper, relationships become lighter, and life begins to carry the rhythm of freedom. No more emotional hurricanes, but a deep inner stillness. Now, the empath no longer needs to forgive in order to feel at peace because they have become peace. They no longer need to love in order to be validated because they have become love. They no longer need to prove their worth because they are living as proof of it. And when they stand in front of the mirror, they no longer see someone broken or someone's former victim. They see a soul that has awakened, one who has learned to protect their light without dimming it. When compassion becomes wisdom, the empath no longer fears losing anyone because they know anything that truly belongs in their life will never need to be rescued. In the end, the empath realizes that the most noble thing they have ever done in this lifetime is not forgiving others, but forgiving themselves. Forgiving themselves for staying too long, for believing too much, for forgetting that their own soul also deserves to be loved, to rest, to be seen. They understand that choosing themselves is not selfishness, but a return to the natural order of life, where love begins within and radiates outward without harming anyone. Carl Jung once said, "No one can illuminate the world without first walking through their own darkness." And the empath has walked through that darkness, the darkness of illusion, of excessive compassion, of wounds disguised under the name love. But instead of being swallowed by it, they transformed that darkness into fuel for awakening. They no longer live to prove their worth to anyone, but to fulfill the mission of their soul, to love with awareness, to give without erasing themselves, and to exist without needing to be understood. When an empath truly chooses themselves, their entire world changes. False relationships dissolve on their own, and new ones aligned with their frequency appear. They no longer feel loneliness, because they realize loneliness is not emptiness, it is the space where the soul expands. They no longer fear losing people, because they understand that anything built on pretense falling apart is liberation, not loss. They know that real love needs no proof, no self-sacrifice to survive, and certainly no endless cycles of meaningless forgiveness. Real love is simply the complete presence between two souls who are already whole. And to arrive there, the empath must learn the most important lesson of all. No one can love them correctly if they do not dare to choose themselves first. So if someone asks, what happens when an empath stops forgiving and chooses themselves? The answer is actually very simple. They don't lose love, they become love. They don't close their heart. They simply stop opening it to hands that do not know how to hold it. And in the quiet of that liberated soul, they finally understand forgiveness may be an ending, but choosing themselves is the true beginning.